Are, are we live? Yes, we are live. Hello, everybody. And welcome to a stream I've been looking forward to all week. Because today, we're going to be talking about D&D. Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. Hey there, Certain Death. Yep. Always love that fellow DMs are showing up and interested in seeing this. So, I'm curious for everybody out there. I know I've got one person here that's a fellow DM. I'm pretty sure I got someone out there, Leon, who has actually not played D&D before. Anyone else hanging around that wants to share kind of you experience with D&D, what editions you play, or you're just showing up to kind of learn about the game just in general? Today we're mostly going to be focusing on kind of how I got into D&D, what resources I use to play it, and how I went about building my own homebrew world, and starting in on some of the founding lore and development process I went for creating a homebrew world for my players to play around in. Oh, permalife. Perma DM. Agreed. That is a life that can happen. I might personally disagree on saying perma DM is best life. But I'm just someone that always really wants to play. Just came to learn how to play. Alright. We won't be going too deep into a lot of the mechanics today, but I am planning on starting off my stream by discussing quite a bit about resources and other things that help me play and help me keep things nice and simple. So I hope that'll help a bit. And if any point along the way, Sans, you have any questions, feel free to ask. Today, we're just chatting about D&D, so I'm fully ready to be answering any questions that come up, pretty much as they come up, until I start getting into my lore, because I won't be interrupting that for much. I became a DM to trick my players into DMing for me, then ended up liking it too much. God, I wish I loved DMing. I enjoy it. I can have fun with it, most certainly. But there's just... I just so much prefer being a player and being able to try and solve problems as opposed to being the one creating them. So welcome to the format we will be taking on in today's discussion. We've got chapters, we've got on-screen visuals. Oh, hell yeah. And so... first things first, I'm just going to be talking a bit about what is D&D. As I think most of the people out there watching know, D&D is a role-playing game, one designed to be played amongst friends that has two basic parts to it. The Dungeon Master, or the DM, and the player. The Dungeon Master is the person in charge of creating the story, narrating what happens, making calls and decisions on what certain roles in the game mean, and oftentimes are in charge of herding cats. But today we're going to be focusing on one of my favorite elements of their job, creating a world to play in. And that is definitely the thing that draws me towards DMing when I do DM. And so... let's get right on into today's talk. So right now, let's see if I've got this set up right. Yeah, there we go. We're going to be talking first about some of the best resources for playing around with D&D, or at least the ones I use most regularly, and I find to help me the most in the way that I'm playing. So right now, just kind of in the image, you can see I got three things I use a lot, though these are definitely not everything I use, and not the only resources to use to get to this. The three main things I use for my current campaign are Roll20, which is an online site that lets you easily play around with dice and maps that you can battle on. D&D Beyond, pretty much one of the premier sources for getting all of your D&D information, monsters, character builders, magic items, and all the official rules, as well as being able to manage campaigns for your players. And then the final big resource I've been using recently, and one that is newer to me and has really only come in with this campaign and kind of the undertaking I went to build out a full world for my players to play around in, is Axar's fantasy maps. Now, before we get all into everything, there is actually one thing I want to drop for all of y'all. So we're going to be going through a lot of resources today, and a few of my own homebrew rules, Google Docs, and things like that. And so, for any point you want to be looking at anything more specifically, you want to remember any of these resources I'm using, or you want to just check out some of the homebrew rules, or some of the homebrew races and classes I've come up with, we've got quite a few commands today. In fact, I'll probably be updating the title to at least include the main command that'll bring everything up for you, which is D&D commands. There we go. Now we got our title updated. So, right there you can see a big old list of a ton of different commands. Some of these will be sending you to Google Docs with a bunch of information. Some of these will be sending you to the resources I use. And one of these will just be sending you to a download if you want to actually look at the map I built. But we'll be getting to most of this one at a time. The very first thing we're going to be talking about today is D&D Beyond. So, as I talked about, D&D Beyond is a Wizards of the Coast owned website. So the people who make D&D basically own and control this website. And that's why this is basically my go-to resource personally for getting all the official, up-to-date information on the different classes, all the spells, the different player races and monsters, feats, equipment, and magic items. This is a resource that you can use for free, though you'll end up having a lot of the expansions, the extra bits and bobs, and certain pieces being price gated. They do want you to subscribe to get full access to everything, and a full disclaimer is I am actually subscribed to them at a gold level. The reason I do that, though, is because of the campaign manager. So this is the one campaign I'm running. I have 6 players in it. Each of them are able to store their characters in here. But most importantly, because I have a gold subscription, all of the players within campaigns I'm running get full access to everything I've purchased on D&D Beyond, as long as the campaign is running. So I do this so that I can share with all of my players all the resources I've bought, so they don't have to be paying to get their own copy of the player's handbook, their own copy of the monster manual, and also so that I can share with them my homebrew collection. This is something that is very important and we'll be discussing more later, but is basically a resource on D&D Beyond that helps you to build homebrewed items, monsters, class feats, and other things within the general format that the whole game uses. As you can see, I have tons of shit I've been making over time. Some of them, like this group here, are actually just a series of feats that allow me to basically make my own homebrew class and just let a player take the feats at each level that show them all the information they need for that class. A lot of these are magic items I've made up, and a lot of these are just monsters I've made to better fit in the lore of my homebrew world. So this is D&D Beyond. This is what I use for my baseline information gathering, learning the mechanics of the game, or just compiling things for the players in my campaigns. However, you definitely do not need this resource to get all of the rules available to you. You can find the PDF for the player's handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, the monster manuals, and almost any expansion online for free. This is just something that helps me compile things simply and share them with my players. But if you're at a point where you're not looking to get a subscription, you're not looking to invest a lot of money, or you've not played the game before and not even sure if you'll like it, Honestly, you can get almost any resource by looking around online and not having to pay the subscription for D&D Beyond. I just do a consistent campaign with a lot of created content, so I find it really helpful for that level of play that I'm doing. Next up, we're going to be talking about, now that we have kind of a basic place where I get all of my rules, my content, and yeah, you can definitely use D&D Wikidot. Or just Googling Player's Handbook PDF will also bring you up basically full PDFs of most of the books. And I don't know how many game stores are open near anybody in chat right now, but you can always go and look at the Player's Handbook yourself as well. Next thing we're going to be talking about is where I play my games. So this is a little website called Roll20. This is a place that I've basically been using since I started playing D&D digitally, which was some 8 to 9 years ago. This is a resource that has been updated in some cases, but is more so for me grandfathered in from my times of playing 4th edition, and just as a resource I'm super familiar with. What Roll20 does for you is it allows you to create maps, grab icons, and create a consistent place where everybody can chat and roll dice, quickly updated, and everybody in the game can see the results. I use it for map building, managing battles, having people roll dice or chat with each other, and basically the whole element of rolling, moving pieces, the actual playing on the board parts of the game, or what I use D&D, is what I use Roll20 for. So Roll20 has some great tools on it, things that allow you to basically find icons to plug into the games. As you can see, this is my party right now, and the last session they ended up, they were about to go into a mine overrun with gnolls. And so I was able to build this whole map setup, this cave system, kind of outside forest land, on Roll20, just using the assets they provide. And once people get into combat, we'll be having them move their pieces around, manage rolls and attacks, all on this board. Some of the other fun tools allow me to kind of switch between different layers of the map, draw different objects or create polygons or shapes. Say a player is making an AoE spell, I'm able to create just a square to represent that and move it around the board to where needed. You're also able to measure distances. Though everything does work on a tile system in D&D and in Roll20. It allows me to reveal or hide places. It's a little hard to tell, but right now the entire mine is actually hidden from my players. And once they start moving in, I'll be able to reveal more of the pieces of it. It helps me manage turn orders. So basically, this is the resource I use for helping me manage combat, rolling, and just the minutia of turn-to-turn play of the game. And I've honestly been enjoying it to the point that I've started playing around with, hey, Shadow Spectrum! How's it going? Yeah, we're just talking about the resources that I use for when I'm playing D&D. Most important thing I recommend looking into if you end up choosing to play around on Roll20 is the creation of macros. These are small bits of code I've created that allow my players to just simply select their piece, type in what role they're wanting to do, and being able to just pull their attributes that I've pre-programmed and give them a role without having them to keep going back to their character sheets and looking up their stat lines. So really, Roll20 for me is the tool of simplification. We do use character sheets if you want to see, where I was talking about on D&D Beyond, having a campaign manager. If we go into this campaign, we can now see all of my characters here. And We'll go ahead and look at one that I think y'all are interested in. This is Pharaoh Brightfeather, currently played by everyone's favorite Junie, or Juniper. And once you go into here, you can see the full character sheet broken down by spells, equipment, different actions, and all their stats. However, to make things more streamlined in the game... Okay, so Roll20 is fantastic. You have 0 experience with online D&D. Yeah, no. I luckily had a bit of experience with online D&D before I started my latest big campaign, but there's definitely a bit of a learning curve to it. If you have any particular questions about issues or solutions with online play, feel free to ask and I'll get right into them. But also, especially on YouTube, you can definitely look up rules to help your players play online better, just because there are some major differences between in-person and online play. So then, while my players can at any point look at their own character sheet, they can also just choose to use these macros, because I've preset... Let's see if this is the right spot. Details... No, it's not here. One moment, please. Here we go. Because I have preset all of their characters to already have their current attributes recorded, so they don't need to be going back and forth and checking. They can just call out the skill, the saving throw, or the type of attack they're making, and my program will automatically grab the correct numbers and just give it to them, so people don't have to worry too much about personally managing every small number. Yeah, although I do find, because my players like to be looking at the map more, just having the macros programmed up here tends to help them not have to keep switching between tabs, and keeps them more immersed in the current scene of the game, or in the current combat. Though definitely, Roll20 itself, if we want to just go here, what's a good action? We'll have Pharaoh use her Guiding Bolt. So let's see. And we will... Ooh. So we'll go ahead. Oof. Honestly, haven't used these macros too much. I just got really into the ones I was using. So let's see here. Can I just dagger attack? Gosh darn it. I know there's definitely ways to use the macros here, so... But, as I'm very much showing, I'm much more used to Roll20. Oh well. I do apologize for that. Ultimately, yeah, a lot of our rolling, health management, and most of the pieces that you can use this character sheet for, we do manage in Roll20, just so we don't have to go back and forth, to the point that I have not used Roll20 enough to actually be super used to the macros. I know they have their own dice rollers, their own macro controls, their own ways that you can manage everything from here if you're wanting to just play from your character sheet directly. Okay, you could double click on a tab to minimize it in Roll20. Looks like you have something cool set up. Stream might have gone burr. I'm currently, where I'm at is actually starting to snow pretty aggressively, and that has been very interesting for my internet. But we should be, for the most part, fine. So, D&D Beyond I use for managing information, all the raw stats, for character building, and all of my homebrew info. Roll20 I use for map building, combat, rolling, and basically all the finicky bits of it. But for my absolute favorite part, I use Asgar's Fantasy Map. So this was a tool I only discovered about a year ago. And if anybody wants to take a look at this, let's see. So this might be... So that should probably be... Let's take a look at the commands. Oh shoot, I don't think I actually added this one in. Well, if anybody so wants it, this is a fun little tool that I discovered when I was trying out just kind of making my own maps and building stuff. And this is a tool that I have found to be one of the best fantasy maps, at least for what I was doing, for just generating, building, and creating a vast, complicated world. This tool comes with a lot of different pieces that you can play around with. I mostly play around with states, cultures, routes, rivers. I love being able to kind of reshape whole regions and being able to custom drag around the coastline or just raise and lower terrain. But the number one thing I wanted to do when I was making my campaign was to create a vast set of unique countries, which this tool does amazingly for me. So let's see here. As this tool lets you basically create, paint, or erase, name, manage, and store as much information as you need on each different state or kingdom that you're creating. In fact, they can go so far as to store up information on exact population, military diversity, and other bits and pieces, though I find myself not actually delving that deep into everything. Mostly just creating unique countries, managing their lore myself through Google Docs, and using routes and cities and borders to really establish just this feeling of moving around the game map. This has been kind of the number one tool that kind of inspired my current campaign, just in all the tools it lets me use to sort of create unique kingdoms and put them right next to each other and show how they all relate to each other and just give a vast overworld map to my players. And with that, we've kind of covered the three major tools I kind of use for just my day-to-day play of D&D. Of course, these aren't all the tools I use. One of the major ones I've talked about is also Google Docs. That is something I use for managing both my DM notes, all of my homebrew rules, and then creating a system of managing all the lore for all 72 of my unique countries and kingdoms here, to make sure everything is legible, readable, and easy to find. In fact, we should have a macro already set up for anybody interested in taking a look at my Google Doc that breaks down all of my countries. I believe it's simply world. And that should be a viewer link that should take you to a Google Doc that shows you all of the nations I've created, organizes them by region, and gives you a quick blurb about each and every one of them. I do forgive anybody not interested in delving into the minutiae of everywhere quite yet, as we're actually about to head into our next little chapter for today's discussion. Going about creating a homebrew world. Now, for people who've played before, or especially for people who haven't played before, you do not need to create your own homebrew environment to play around in. D&D has a vast amount of available lore, worlds, pre-made settings, and just a ton of stuff you can dig into that already exists that creates a cohesive setting for all of the races, classes, monsters, and gods you would encounter in the world that the rules generally provide you. I know a lot of people who pretty much just play within the classic D&D world. However, I actually never have. Ever since I started playing with 4th edition and onward, every campaign I've run or been in has basically been a homebrew world or a homebrew country, basically. I don't know why it is I've never really been drawn to pre-made worlds or pre-made campaigns, but there's just always something about creating the world, creating the lore, and just being the lore master of everything that happens, that just lets me sink my teeth into the system and just makes me feel more and more like the DM of it. Like someone who really already knows or can make a call on anything. My very first campaign I ever played, when I knew nothing about anything, was simply me having my players walk down a road, go into a mine, and fight some goblins. My second campaign was me and one of my friends dual DMing. And I remember, oh yes, that is fantastic. We sat down at his kitchen table one weekend when we didn't have any homework to do. We gathered together a bunch of lined paper, loose leaf lined paper, and we spent all day taping it together on one side so that we could flip it over and have a smooth, massive piece of paper that we then drew an entire world map on, populated it with cities, countries, important locations, drew with pencil where forests and mountains were, and just created the world from scratch on loose leaf paper that we taped together into a world map. Then, as we came up with events we wanted to happen, important cities we wanted to send people to, we wrote down just quick notes on sticky notes and stuck it to the map. Axars has been very helpful to me moving away from that and moving more digital. But it's just something I've always done, is creating my maps from scratch. Hell yeah. So yeah, this is one of the versions of the current map of the world my actual players are playing in. If you like, let's turn on the mountains for everybody. Though it tends to make the system a little slower to react. There we go. So this is the current modern setup for my world. Yeah, so this tool, Axars, that I use, 100% you don't have to use this tool. Like I said, I started pencil and paper map creation, and you can do that. You can use, there are dozens of resources online. This has just been my favorite for creating a large amount of countries to manage, but there are others that are much better for creating terrain, routes, smaller map styles, more specific city builds. This has just been really good for what I wanted to do with my campaign. But this also comes with a large set of tools. Creating cities, creating rivers from scratch, managing military. You can also entirely control height map. Let's see if I can pull that up. Where is our height map? So you can preset biomes here. You can, there we go. Let's turn off states. You can mess around with a height map, and you can get a tool to resculpt the height map however you want. And if you so want, like I did here, you can go in, click on the coast, and go absolutely ham with reshaping how you want the coastline to look. Entirely deleting, moving, or reshaping everything as much as you want. I wanted to keep everything a little realistic. So a lot of what you see from me is based heavily on the default generated map that this game provided for me. Hey, Aqua, thank you very much for the follow. And then from there, I went back over kind of the general shape they gave me, which was very similar to what you're seeing here. And I decided I wanted to kind of take a look at how I thought the tectonic plates would work here, and how I wanted things to move over time. So I reshaped, I added mountains, because to me I was feeling, okay, this landmass and this landmass, to me they look like they're moving away from each other. So where they're moving, I built up mountain ranges here and here to kind of represent this slow shift apart of two tectonic plates. But also that was me going a little over the top, I think. And this tool, let's go ahead. I should already be saved up. And we'll just hit random generate. When you do that, it'll create a board, like an outline of a world for you. It'll pre-create its own height map for it, set rivers, cities, and nations. So let's go ahead, take out the height map, put on states. And then from here, you can go around to begin editing things as much as you want. Like my major tool that I used was, of course, the states tool. So here now, if I use the paintbrush, I can now, let's here say, I want this country to expand its control over this island. So I just kind of paint it up here. But these guys are in direct conflict with them and trying to intercept them as they build out. I hit confirm, and voila. So this is definitely the tool I really wanted, just because it really is good for country building and state to state. It does have height map, river control, coastline control, and a bunch of other tools to use. I say technically there could be. It probably would be one of the hardest ways to do it, because this tool is based around generating a map and then editing it. But if I go into tools, let's see, there is a way to do a full height map change. Yeah, so if we click here, what you can see is this says if you change around the height map, we'll probably have to regenerate everything. So if you're starting from scratch, what you can do is generate a map, go into this height map, and then just basically go to a tool, maximum power and radius, and you can just go through everything and put everything basically bottom of sea level if you really already have something designed and want to do. Basically erase it all, then come in with however much strength or whatever you want, and start doing a slow kind of drawing of what you're wanting to create. Obviously, because you're going to have a little bit of some randomness to your heights, it's very likely once you have, say, the shape correctly put out, you're probably going to have to come back in with a much lower power and kind of correct any height map issues you're seeing. But then once you're done, let's see, so we'll just exit that tool. Yeah, so once you're done, the tool will also, it takes a minute for it to generate everything. It's going to be a little confused because of how much of the map I deleted. So you might have to go back through the tools once everything gets totally set. Let's see here. Yeah, so it'll definitely confuse it. And you'll probably actually have to save this map as is and then reload the page to get back into all of the tools and delete, like, it's remembering there were countries here, but, like, I'll just load up what I already have in storage, which is my normal map. Let's get rid of provinces and go pull up states. But let's just say I had redrawn this from scratch, but it was showing a bunch of countries I didn't want. You can always just go to the state tool, see, like, yeah, this big place down here, this was a leftover country that it's trying to put over the water. I could just say, yes, remove this. And it'll remove all of its stored info and just give you a blank place. So if at any point you're getting issues with countries, roads, or other things going over, if you're trying to start a map from scratch, you can, on your own, go back and delete things. But this tool is definitely more designed for generating and editing. So there will be some finicky issues if you're trying to create something totally from scratch within it. But yeah. So this is kind of that's the major tool and kind of what inspired me to really build out this latest campaign I was doing. But let's get back on the chapter we're talking about with creating a homebrew world. I guess with me always having done it, it just kind of felt natural for me to go ahead and begin that way when I was trying to make one of my bigger campaigns. But I'd say there's a few things to always keep in mind whenever you're going about building your own world. The first step that I find myself always kind of going over, and this is just because I'm a bit of a lore junkie, is how much of base D&D lore do you want to use? what are your favorite parts of D&D lore and what are your least favorite parts. D&D has been running for decades. There are many different editions. No problem, Leon. Yep, we'll probably be getting into the lore before you get back. So hopefully you'll be here once I'm done with just talking about my tools and strategies. So, how much of the lore you want to use, how much of it you know. You can definitely start lore from scratch, though I find that to be very hard. I can also imagine, though, there being people who just love the lore building more so than, or on the same degree that I love the country building. But because there's so many different generations and editions of D&D lore, and they have so much lore available, I love using it as a broad baseline when I'm building a world. I love picking out my favorite bits and using that to be kind of the fundamental building block that I create my lore out of. And also, probably the most important element when you go about starting on building your own homebrew world, building your own homebrew lore, is what is kind of the goal of your campaign. So, I had two major goals with my campaign when I was starting to build it. The very first goal I had was very self-indulgent. I wanted to make a vast world, majorly geopolitically involved between tons of different countries and city-states, just because that's where I have the most fun building. The second goal that I kind of had in mind was I wanted my players to feel almost perfectly involved in the lore building of this world. I wanted them to get in at the beginning, learn a lot of how these countries interact, about a lot of the lore, and then over the course of a long campaign, start seeing how their actions have changed borders, have changed the future, and then eventually, whenever our current campaign finds a good stopping point, being able to start a second campaign within the same world, decades in the future, so that there's just this feeling that my players have helped create this vast, complicated, lore-filled world. Because of that sort of build, I knew a lot of my ancient lore I would be borrowing heavily from just base D&D, because the ancient lore to me wasn't as important as the recent world history. What has led up to the present day, what is the status quo of the world, and just establishing something so that my players will have kind of that status quo at the beginning of their mind, and then be able to just look back and say, yeah, that's how things used to be. Here's what we've done. I'm hoping the VOD gets saved, because this definitely seems like something people would want to listen to and hear about. You're doing really good at having an easy to listen to VOD. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, because much like I think 90% of people, I despise the sound of my own voice. Thank you very much, Shadow. So with kind of those goals in mind, once you have how much of the base lore you're wanting to use, how much you're wanting to create, knowing what your favorite or least favorite parts of the lore are, and then knowing what the goal of your world for you and your players is, we move into kind of the step-by-step process for building a world. This is going to change from DM to DM, world creator to world creator. But like I said, my big player goal was to get them to feel invested, like they created it. So me, my first step was I went around to each of my players and I had them invent a country for me. It could be a city-state, a kingdom, a country, or just a collection of tribes. I wanted them to give me just, tell me about this place. Give me one paragraph of lore for it. What is its culture like? How is it the way it is? What do you like about this place? And once I did that, I had like 5 pre-created countries I had a kind of small collection of villages inspired by Midsomner that had just this dark underbelly to it. I had this illustrious, sort of highly religious, almost Incan-inspired nation built around sacrifice, but for the greater good. I had a large kingdom, expansionist and kind of founded around almost medieval Germany. Hell yeah, I'm vibing, Junie. And then I just started filling in the blanks around them. So if I have this secretive place in the mountains where they're sacrificing people, what is something fun to put next to it? Something that allows that place to exist secretly, but that also just gives that feeling of unease, of having a nation bordering a secret religious kingdom. And so that's where I ended up making almost a very Hobbit-inspired meadow region populated with hobbits and mousekin that just live at the foot of these large mountains where something dark and mysterious happens at the top of. So that's where I started from, is getting my players invested by having them create, each of them, their own nation, at least in part, completing the lore for each of them. Oh shit, it's Zora Magdaros! And then starting to create all the countries in between them. Who is this kingdom at war with? Why are they not conquering the world already? What has them hemmed in? Who are their vassals? Building out just all of these countries. So for me, that was my starting point, was just sort of that era of investment. And then the whole world was changed. Yeah, so I'm actually having a couple of my players popping in. Juniper and Lotus. I'm glad to see you guys coming here. I hope you have fun listening, though you've gotten a lot of this spiel before. So once I kind of set up my first pieces that I wanted for building the world, I then kind of had to take a step back a bit. Because one of the most important elements to D&D is the fact that gods are real. That there's pantheons, there's outer planes, there's magic. I can't just build a world based around real historic countries, seeing how they interact, because all of this is made after the fact by actual gods and primordials that do exist in the world. And now, like I've said, D&D has decades of gods being created and put in, killed, changed, reborn. There's so much pantheons, so much lore on the gods, that for me, my first step was just going in and trimming up all of the god lore as much as I could. And that's where I created this fun little Google Doc that I call my Fell Gods. This is where I basically went through all of the pantheons that existed and trimmed all of them down from the some 24 gods each pantheon or each plane or location usually has, reducing it down to 4 or 5, both to make it more manageable for me and more manageable for my players who are looking through for their god. Now, you definitely don't have to do this. You can definitely just take the pantheons as they exist from D&D lore, or create your own entirely. The thing is, because I decided I was going to be borrowing heavily from the early lore of D&D, that a lot of my ancient lore was going to be based around existing stuff, I needed to also base my pantheons and gods around it, but I wanted to simplify it a lot, so I'm not looking at a list of 200 possible gods, but just looking at one of maybe 30 or 40, which is already a little ridiculous for me to keep track of, but is so much more manageable that for me, it was just an important step for me to do. The next big step for me, like I said, was establishing that ancient history. What has brought all of these nations up to the point that they're at? And with that ancient history, the most important thing, I think, for any storytelling endeavor is establishing status quo. So, once I built my pantheon, once I started where I wanted the modern world that my players are playing in to look like, and once I started in on creating the ancient history, the most important step for me creating that history was making sure it all built up a status quo for my players to entirely break, cast aside, and point to and say, that is how things used to be. Here's what we have done to the world. And so, let's see. I had a problem with allowing all the gods for the Forgotten Realms, so now I just make my own. Yeah, no, there's huge problems with just going with raw D&D lore, because it is vastly confusing and ever-changing. I definitely went through all of the Forgotten Realms gods and trimmed them down. So I'm certain there's technically some people I've cut that should not be cut, some people that I've kept who aren't as important. But the most important thing to keep in your mind at the end of the day is you're the DM, you're the creator of the world. You are free to make these judgment calls yourself and entirely make it from scratch, or make it broken and just say, yep, the system is broken. How is that fun for the players to interact with? So all in all, those are like the broad steps that I took when creating my world. Establishing the places my players wanted to make. Filling out everything in between those places. Creating a consistent pantheon for myself, for the lore, for my players. And then building out an ancient history that establishes a status quo for my players to react against. So with all of those established, we can go ahead and move on to our next chapter. And this is where I'm actually going to be starting in on my world's lore. Welcome to the world of Deorum. Or at least the oldest available map we have. You see, this ancient map actually comes to us from the Second Age, from the Empire of Light, as you can see here kind of illustrated in the middle. There's of course the large, vast Badlands, the Phaethon Kingdom, Baron Verdun, there's the tribes, the wastes, and over here the large Ascrostian Empire. This map, however, does not capture the lore well before this. For you see, Deorum, or the name of our world, means of the gods, or where the gods tread, or most literally, God's footprint. And it got this name from the history before mortal history, the time before many of the races that walked our material realm walked. You see, the material realm, or where our planet exists, at one time was not populated by vast mortal races, was not overseen by the gods, but was instead a vast primordial soup, a place where elemental beings, where aboleths, dark creatures of high intelligence and immortal lifespan, the earth elementals, the wind elementals, creatures created from raw energy, roamed the world, overseers of all the forces and powers upon it. During this ancient primordial time of the world, there were a few mortal races, but not all the ones we know of in our world today. There were no large kingdoms of elves, no dwarves. Even the small amount of humans that existed were not vast or developed in the same way. They were instead enslaved to these primordial powers, to the aboleths, to the earth elementals, to the great winds. They were servants, brought against their will and made to serve these ancient powers. But in their harsh service, they all grew to hope, to wish, to desire some greater power to free them. It was through this prayer that all these mortal beings had that the first gods were created. Created out of the image of the existing races, creating out of different hopes, wishes, powers, emotions, dedications. Many gods began to arise. And these gods, seeing some mortal races in this world, seeing the primordials that ruled it, went to war. For thousands of years, the gods and the primordial powers fought over Deorum. This great fight, however, turned the planet to a wasted soup of elements. Muck, lava, high windswept regions, and just infinite oceans roiled with constant warfare of unbelievable power. The few mortal races that survived retreated deep underground in an attempt to escape the unlivable conditions. This war would have continued forever had not one great power named Ao emerged, the god of gods, or at least so everyone believed. With a snap of his fingers, Ao separated the primordials and the gods, granting each of them their own world. But to the gods, Ao invoked a punishment, or really a learning experience. All of the gods that existed at the time of the separation of the worlds into the one ruled by the gods and the one by the primordials. Ao commanded all of the gods to walk their world, to create the mortal races, to oversee them, to help guide them. And so our world was named Deorum, the footprint of the gods, or where the gods tread. As for an epoch, all the gods in the heavens did walk this world. And they created the races. They guided them along their path. Until the day that Ao said, "So the gods have learned to love their creations, to understand the material and the mortal realm." And he rose the gods back to their heavens, leaving the mortal races on Earth. Well, on Deorum. To sudden shock, they were now alone again, though not entirely. They could always pray, as they did in the past, but no longer did their gods walk amongst them. And so began the Mortal Ages. This is the beginning of not recorded history, but the history as the mortals tell it, with the very first age called the Wild Age. This was an age of confusion for the mortals, for now the world was theirs to explore without the guidance of their gods, their creators, the ones who oversaw them, who promised them rewards, were no longer visible and present for them. So this age was considered wild for almost all races and nations that began to form. At this time, perhaps nation would be the wrong word, as most areas were simply tribal, beginning from scratch in the creation of a society outside of their gods, where they no longer treaded behind their gods' footsteps, looking up at them, but instead had to create a society where their gods could not provide everything immediately to them. There was, however, as you see on this map, one large empire in the far south, called Baron Verdan. During the time that the gods walked, none of them tread here. This place was a tundra desert, scoured of life. Without any real value to any of the gods, it was left abandoned. except, of course, by those who did not seek their gods' approval, those who fled their gods, those who knew they would not be accepted by those amongst the gods. Barenverden thus became a place that attracted tieflings in vast numbers, humans who had abandoned their human gods and now sought refuge, orcs who did not wish to praise Grompsh or anyone whose gods were not altogether kind to them and wished to find a life outside of their influence. Thus, Barenverden was abandoned while the gods walked, and the tribes that built themselves there had a vast head start on all those who followed their gods. For Barenverden developed a warring tribal culture that pushed them to develop weapons, to develop magic, to create ways to war against each other's tribes where they knew the gods would not provide them with what they wanted or needed. And so, halfway through the Wild Age, as the tribes of the vast world were just establishing themselves, a vast horde descended from Barenverden, as one tribe had united all the Barenverden war masters and sent them out to conquer the world at large. And Barenverden did conquer most of it, unable to challenge these men with metal clothes, with magic at their fingertips, riding on horses, using metal weapons where most of the tribes at this time used bone and stone. Barenverden captured over half the world. They were only stopped when one location, who praised the gods more fervently than any other, crowned their first king. Herostis, the first king of the lawful good gods and the creator of the Empire of Light. With the crowning of Herostis, the world was suddenly blessed with clerics and paladins to fight back Barenverden. And thus began the second of the four mortal ages, the Age of Worship. Here was a re-establishing of the worship to the gods, of the powers they could provide. And it was only through Herostis and the Empire of Light that the evil people horde of Barenverden was cast back south. Now, they would rise up again many times. In fact, there have been 5 great marches of Barenverden over the course of history. But each time they faced the Empire of Light and were cast back by it. After the third breaking of Barenverden, though, a new age was started. This would be called the Age of Empires, as this was a time when every large region began coalescing. Barenverden had been an empire of its tribes for a long time. The Empire of Light united many cities under the influence of all the lawful good gods. The dwarven kingdoms united into a single force. The elves created their own kingdom within a deep forest valley. And far, far to the east began the Ascrostian Empire. This was a place founded by a single kingdom of Ascrostia that through diplomacy, warfare, and one of the most interesting systems of integration created the world's largest, longest-standing empires. The Ascrostians was a unity of over 12 large kingdoms, all of which were granted vast autonomy. And during the Age of Empire, it grew to its largest size, as shown here. However, during that time, the Empire of Light grew large as well. And as they both expanded, there eventually came a time where they would, of course, engage in warfare. This war started by crushing the middle territory of the Mortem Republic. While not an official member of this vast war between these two empires, its land was used as the killing fields, the battlegrounds. The Mordem people tried to remain neutral, and for their neutrality, their ground was salted and burned so that Ascrostian Empire's enemies wouldn't be able to farm there. Their people were pushed into levy systems to fight for one side or both, and their nation was left in ruins by this war, as they were seen as nothing but the land Ascrostia and the Empire of Light would fight over. However, the Age of Empires would be brought low by one single, catastrophic, and unexplainable event. Something simply called the Sundering. It was believed it would be the greatest battle between Ascrostian forces and the Empire of Light ever. Both arranged all of their major military force, all of their vast leadership, on one battlefield, and charged. Each side promising this would be the end. Each side knowing if they won, the world would become theirs. But it would not be. For as soon as both armies crashed, a screaming sound filled the air. The wrenching of tectonic plates, a blinding light and flash of unimaginable heat. This sound, this cracking and rending of earth, was heard as far as the Dwarven Empire. This was called the Sundering, as the entire region was eviscerated in a matter of seconds. You can see the aftermath here. Where once the Morden Republic was now a vast salt swamp, where the land was utterly eviscerated, and the ocean filled that gap. Horribly for both nations, with all of their military forces eliminated overnight, with both nations having lost a vast amount of their leadership. Both empires began to crumble. The Ascrostian Empire had a failsafe. They allowed all of their kingdoms total autonomy to fix themselves during this catastrophe. Because of this, the Ascrostian Empire as a whole would remain in its size, though its power would become only a fraction of what it once was, being diluted over dozens of kingdoms, all desperate for aid. The Empire of Light, however, would fracture apart from this event. Its long-standing allies to the south, the Ananora, would secede from them, claiming that this kingdom no longer provided them protection, and that they must establish themselves in order to protect themselves from any future Baron Verdant invasions. In the far north, the regions they had captured from the uplands also revolted to establish their own duchies that they once had. In the far south, these regions were once their vast workshops of slaves, vast mining systems and productions filled with thousands of kobolds, gnomes, goblins, the races that needed subjugating, would immediately collapse into disarray and no longer feed the Empire what it wanted. And then most importantly, the middle of the Empire would eventually sever itself into a region to this day called Polamont. Here you can see how things collapsed for the Empire of Light, now only referred to as the Cities of Light. Their once vast empire, now split between the Polamont, the Cities of Light, the gnomes of the Papani, and the Benor Mountains. The empire was totally and utterly destroyed by the Sundering. And that is why the Sundering began our current mortal age, the Age of Reformation. This age is named as we watch the different tribes form themselves into duchies, into kingdoms, as the collapsing empires reforge themselves into new shape. This age is one about the creation of a new great power system. Or at least it would have been, if not for the move of the Osrostian Empire, or at least by a single prince of the empire. The Sundering happened nearly 2,000 years ago, but an even darker event happened only 500 years ago. The rise of the Viscounts, and our final major lore piece for this evening. As I've stated, the Osrostian Empire was able to hold itself together, though granting great autonomy to its different kingdoms. The prince of this empire, though, upon a trip to the far north of his realm, found something dark and long lost. When he returned home, when he returned to his emperor father's throne, he strode through the palace grounds, up to the throne, and succeeded his father through violence. No one knew why this prince seemed to have snapped and become a tyrant overnight. After all, even as he rose to power, tyranny was not his order. He continued the law of the land for a long time. It would only be a decade later, though, that he would announce the rise of the Viscounts. For whatever that boy had discovered on his trip, or whatever had happened to him, had changed him irrevocably. And now, he began the expansion of a vampire empire. He declared the new order of the Viscounts, a group of 10 or so elder vampires that would oversee all of the kingdoms and create the system for the Osrostian Empire. They established an order for everything. Nobility would be allowed to be risen to vampires. Those who became knights could rise. Slave forces would now be dual as manual labor and food source. Thus, Osrostia grew in power again under this new force of vampirism. However, a mortal world cannot abide a vampire empire. And thus began what is to this day dubbed the Viscount War. All nations of the world had agreed to drive back the Osrostians, as they had declared themselves an undead empire. And thus, the creation of what would be called the Balkanization Treaties began. All nations of the world would contribute military and resources to a vast war to drive the vampires from this world forever. The entire world then united and began conquering back large regions of the Osrostian Empire, until the world took a shape that you see here. This is all that stands now, this red region of the vampire's empire. This large purple region here is what is called the Balkans. Built under the Balkanization Treaty, each large area of land freed from the vampire's control would be reshaped into a new kingdom After all, this war was not about expansionism. It was about snuffing out an undead threat to the world. So these kingdoms would be freed and balkanized so that everything could return to peace. At the current day that our campaign starts, the Ascrostian Empire still exists, though a clear shadow of its former glory. It has stalemated the war along the vast mountain ranges of its current borders. The war still rages, and there is hope that the Ascrostians will be defeated. There is fear, however, that Baron Veridon might rise again. There is concerns with the vast kingdom of Aethrone, shown here, in its expansionist cause, creating new war that will drive people away from fighting the Ascrostians. The Polemont nation, too, has begun becoming more and more expansionist. It is unclear now what the future of the Age of Reformation will be. We do not know if the Ascrostian vampires will be defeated and driven out. We do not know if the Balkanization treaties will hold, or if nations will begin seizing land for themselves. We do not know if war will break out between Aethrone and Polemont, preventing real dedication to the Viscount War. And we do not know what all the other regions will do once these great forces begin moving. That is the current state of Deorum. With a vast history of growing empires and conflict, we are faced with an age that our players enter into. One where everything is reshaping and can be easily tilted in one direction or another. So began my campaign with my players in a small city-state near the borders of two large nations, though far from the front lines of the Ascrostian War. My party began in the small city-state of Scarin. Thank you very much, everybody who has stuck through the big, in the beginning, Deorum in the Mortal Ages, and now to the beginning of my campaign. I hope you all enjoyed my long-winded lore drop about the vast history of the world I created. And now, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you very much. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. If anybody wants to dig into any of these nations' lore, you can go on ahead and I'll give the full command list, actually. D&D commands. There you go. If anybody wants to actually download this pre-made map I'm showing to you right now, that is where my map files will actually give you this, and you can download that file and plug that in to Agzar's fantasy map, and it'll load it up for you to look at. Or edit to your own desires if you're so interested in this world. As you can see, I spent a lot of time just really establishing a history for my players to play around with, creating a status quo for them to react to, and making sure I put them into one of the more interesting and easily influenced timetables I could. Now then, if people are interested, I actually have some questions for the viewers for what we should talk about next. After all, there's quite a bit of lore here, so we could dive right into it, or we can look around at some other things about me creating my world. A few examples I can have are, there was one nation I created called Scarpy that I actually went through, and because I'm an insane person, I went through the process of creating from scratch their own language. I wanted to make something that, when spoken, would almost sound like English, so that you would pick out words you recognize as characters spoke, but would still be unable to fully comprehend it. I could go more deeply into the lore of the pantheon I created, why I represent the Fel and the Fae here, and what gods I chose and why. We could, of course, delve more deeply into each individual of my 72 countries, and I can give you a more in-depth look at any of their lore. I could also show you guys the house rules my party and I established during our session 0. I can go over rules I've created and why, show you some of my custom things like drunkenness rules, my unique flanking rules, and intentional falling that I find to be fun. I could also, if people are interested, go through and show you guys a lot of my homebrewed items and monsters. And our final piece, and probably one that I like quite a bit, is I can share with you all my homebrew, what would it be? Expansion. Because I am a mad lad, I have been working over the course of 2 years now to create a little collection of my own homebrewed classes, subclasses, and fresh races, all based around the Shadowfell and the Fey Wilds. All of this is at everyone's disposal. And all of this I could talk about for hours. So, what are you all feeling? Want to learn about my homebrew races and classes? Want to learn about my house rules that I love, why I made them, and what they do to my campaign? Do you want to dive more deeply into different lore elements? Into the gods? Or take a quick look at my insanity of creating a language? Let's see if I am good enough at creating a poll for you guys. This is going to be a big poll. I'm probably going to need a minute here. But I will work on getting this set up for us to go ahead and look at. So, what shall we discuss next? Let's see here. Option 1. We can look at country lore. Start breaking down more specific nations if you're curious about anything. We can look at my house rules. We can look at my homebrew races and classes. We can look at items and monsters. Or what would be a really fun last option? Or I suppose I could begin telling you the story of what's happening in my campaign now. Let's see here. Yeah, I'll give you guys a few minutes to take a look over all this. There we go. Yes, choices. Okay, give me a second and I will catch up with chat. Let's see. I'm just here hoping can keep talking. I'm fine with whatever, lol. You do like monsters. Okay. You basically have enough written down for a whole campaign setting book. Pair this with art and you can... Thank you very much. Unfortunately, a lot of my homebrew shit isn't actually totally done. And, like you said, pairing it with art is always a fun thing. But I am kind of a balancing freak, so I keep going back and rebalancing stuff so often that it's been a while since I gotten through everything. Yes, so we have 5 choices for you guys to go through. I have the poll posted up, and it looks like we're already pretty well split on what people want to talk about. So, we've got a few minutes for everybody to take a look. So, while we're waiting for people who have already voted, do you have any quick questions you have? Anything like how I discovered tools? Anything quick like how did I invent certain parts of this? Anything like telling a quick story about your own time creating or playing D&D, or even just base D&D questions. While we're waiting for the poll to finish, I'm more than happy to really just talk about what you guys like. Okay, you're making a homebrew class right now. How do I go around balancing? So for me, step one is know for a fact, no matter what you do, first draft is going to be unbalanced to hell. Things are going to be too strong, things are going to be too weak. Don't worry about balancing strength on your first pass through homebrewing. Instead, what I'm going to say is just perfectly capture the image in your mind of how you want this to play and write down overly specific rules, overly powerful, overly weak. Just capture the raw essence of it down on paper so you know where you want this to feel. Once that's done, when it comes to actually balancing things, the number one thing to remember is D&D is not a balanced game. It is a window of balance game. So, the most important thing is if you're making a class, a subclass, a race, or anything, to just look at all the existing stuff and just balance it against that. Be inspired by what exists. The main class I've been working on is a combination of warlock, barbarian, and fighter into this really strange sort of creation that's just sort of this really tanky, low damage caster. Okay. So the vote is done. I do have one more question I will be answering, but it looks like we're going to go ahead and start on the story of the campaign. So, my first introduction. So, yes, this is the order we'll do it. First, I'll go over kind of my introduction or my first experience with D&D, and then I'll start telling you guys the story of our current campaign. And for that, I'll actually probably move over to the map and zoom right on in on Scarin for all of y'all. There we go. So, my very first experience with D&D was technically through my dad. So my dad had actually played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, or as I like to think of it, the first official, edition of Dungeons and Dragons. I know there were earlier books, earlier collections, but that was the first cohesive system put out. And so my dad had all the books from Advanced D&D, and he would like to show me and tell me about the game. And I got super inspired about it. So, on the day that 4th edition dropped, I had him take me out to a game store. I bought the 4th edition player manual, Dungeon Master Guide, and Monster Manual all in one sitting and spent all the money my little freshman self had made at that point in my life to get those books. Next, I gathered up 4 of my friends who were like, yeah, I've heard of D&D. Sure, we can give it a try. And I gathered them up, and I sat down, and we all learned how hard it was to make a character your very first time. So really, my first ever experience with D&D was me and a bunch of friends passing the player's handbook back and forth with printed off, empty, simplified player character sheets, just filling everybody's character out one at a time, all of us helping each other to understand what the rules were. And then I started DMing for them without a battle map, without anybody really fully understanding the backstory of their characters or what was happening. I had them walk down a road, get attacked by some wolves, go into a mine, and fight a bunch of goblins. All in all, we spent about 4 hours character building and 1 hour playing the game. And I am 100% certain we played everything incorrectly, and we still all have stories from that first session that we tell to this day. I think The best way to put my first ever session was chaotic, without any of the real rules being understood, and just entirely about a bunch of us trying to learn how to play the game. Interestingly, it was after that session that me and one of those people decided to do our second session as dual DMs, splitting up a lot of the responsibilities and effort, and then made the bad decision of DMing for a group of 8 or 9 players. It was more manageable with 2 of us, but that game got got out of hand at times. So those would be my first major experiences. Chaotic. No one knowing what they're doing. Everything working as wonky as hell. Sounds like an average D&D session. That's fair. Though I would say definitely multiply tenfold, as there's no one there that could say, aren't you supposed to have a reaction? I do understand 9 people was insane. Like I said, we did have 2 of us DMing, and we actively worked to help whenever people split, to have one of the DMs take the other group into another room and be constantly communicating just between the 2 of us about what was happening. It was a lot more manageable than I thought it was, but still got very out of hand when players started, inevitably for high schoolers, getting in each other's way. But, you all voted, and so now we will begin our story of my current campaign. Where to begin? Perhaps to begin, we should, instead of looking at the map, go into the campaign. Originally, I only had 5 players. And they included Malachite, who is a Genasi Ranger, Pharaoh Brightfeather, an Aarakocra Cleric, Milo Under the Bridge, a Halfling Bard, Rasmussen Granitehide, a Dwarven Fighter, and Tortuga Lokren, a Monk and Elf. When I started the campaign, all my players started at level 2, I believe. I didn't want to start people at level 1 where they wouldn't have any tools, but I also wanted my first session, or at least after the first 2 sessions, to end with that crunchy level up of hitting level 3. For most classes, hitting level 3 is that point where you make your first big decision about something. That first point when you really feel that change in level. And so I wanted that to be the first crunchy event that happened. So, our story doesn't even begin, though, with the party as a whole, but instead in 3 parts. You see, because Rasmussen Granitehide actually came from here, the Benor Moldir, a mountain of a group of dwarves called the Benor Dwarves, far estranged from the kingdom to the far north. Rasmussen had left the mountains some 100 or so years ago. Ooh. Let's not do that. And had been wandering around the region here of Papani, the Cities of Light, and Pulamont, simply doing odd jobs. He, however, eventually settled into doing a lot of work for Pulamont. His most recent job assigned to him by one of their Grand Generals, who also handed over to Rasmussen one of his most accomplished rangers, Malachite. They had a simple job. You see, Pulamont and Aethrone were the 2 major powers of this region, and had been in sort of a cold war for a long time, snapping up every smaller city-state that separated them. And the last major one remaining was Scarin. Rasmussen and Malachite's job, as told to them by Felix, was to scout out the region of Scarin, to go into the city, find out the different political factions that were moving, who was allied with Polamont's push to take the region, and report all of that information back to him. So, Rasmussen and Malachite crossed the border as scouts and partially as spies, moving into Scarin to help it lean in the direction of falling to Polamont. Far in the north, in a very secretive region, a single Aarakocra cleric left her home and traveled south. It would be in the region known as Tverfia, where she would encounter a battle, a vast open field affair fought between Tverfian infantry and Athronian heavy cavalry. She would overlook this battle and watch people dying in the hundreds in an instant as cavalry rode through the peasant infantry. Awestruck by this sight, she would turn to see a small halfling approaching her, a man named Milo who had left his own home recently, and now only had a pony and a wagon carrying all of his possessions. Looking upon this cleric, Milo decided this would be a good traveling companion, though they needed to leave Tverfia as the war was spreading, so they would follow the road southwards, and this would also eventually lead them to Scarin, as wanderers without clear purpose in this time. Thus, it was on the streets of Scarin that our party began to coalesce. Milo and Pharaoh would settle down in an open-air tavern, a strange place without walls but with a ceiling that had open tables. It was very cheap to eat and rest here, obviously. And so they arranged for food and water to be brought to them, and began their meal in this new place, trying to gather some knowledge about what Scarin was like. They learned that the city-state was caught in sort of a territory war between Athrone and Polamont, though it seemed to not be affecting these wanderers. It was during this meal, though, that Pharaoh noticed a pair of people seemed to be watching her curiously. A dwarf and a strange green rocky woman. Realizing that they had been caught staring, Rasmussen and Malachite made their leave, pulling away into an alleyway where they would discuss their plans. Only they were followed by Pharaoh and Milo, who then questioned them about why they had been staring at them. Here, Rasmussen would then explain that they were simply travelers in this city, and that they had simply not expected to see an Aarakocra here. After all, most Aarakocra live far south. Hey, yep, we're dropping a quick story of basically the first session. It was after this point, they decided they could have a meal together. And so the four sat down and began eating and discussing their business. Rasmussen and Malachite, not wanting to give away their scouting and spying tendencies, explained that they were merchants in town to sell their wares. Milo and Pharaoh found them interesting, and so asked if they needed people to travel with them. Unable to explain they had been telling a lie, Rasmussen, thinking on his feet, agreed, deciding he would deal with this bridge later if it ever became an issue. However, their meal was then interrupted by screams for help, as a blood-soaked man was brought into town. It seems he had been attacked by wild animals in the forest and was dying, bleeding out. This was our last party member, Tortuga Lochran, brought in, and in the first second of his encounter, I had him rolling death saving throws. And he failed the first roll. While a harsh way to introduce a player to the game, I suppose, it also allowed for the moment of Milo explaining that he could help, running to this new injured man. and healing him with magic. However, Milo was unaware that Tortuga was a very nervous and untrusting person, and having been about to strike the beast that had taken him down, struck his savior across the face in the first instant of coming to consciousness. Milo then would spit out a pair of teeth before Pharaoh would approach him, healing him in turn. Yes, session 1 is always very fun for players. Especially when you say, oh yes, and that's you. Wait, I'm already dying? Yep. They then had to ask this strange, injured man what had happened. Oh, Junie, have you changed your name? To which Tortuga explained that he had been told by the mayor that he could earn a great deal of money by killing some boar in the woods. However, he had taken on a mother and her brood, and had, unfortunately, fallen victim instead of being the victor. So, hearing the offer of money, and without much else to do, the party offered their services to Tortuga, saying they would help him hunt down these beasts in exchange for a share of the gold. Now coalesced as a party, they moved out of the city and into the woods, and began to track the beasts that had nearly killed Tortuga. They would eventually find ripped apart pieces of a boar and blood trails leading deep within the woods. While nervous about what this might be, the mayor had apparently told Tortuga that any beast would pay handsomely. So the party pushed forward until they encountered the den of a pair of cave bears. Creatures that could almost instantly kill any one of the fighters here. Though, not one to back down, Tortuga immediately dove into battle. And everyone else, not feeling like abandoning this man, joined in as well. Rasmussen took moves to drive back one of the bears, using a series of whip attacks in combination with some very lucky intimidation rolls. The rest of the party then began on the one bear, hoping to bring their numbers down and give themselves a great advantage in this fight. Malachite then revealed she was a unique type of ranger, preferring instead of using a bow to go into combat with a pair of blades, focusing down one target at a time that she had marked with her abilities. The first round went well, the party dealing a great deal of damage to the bear. However, on its turn, it critted Tortuga and dropped him down to 1 hit point in a single swipe of his claw. As Tortuga fell backwards, he felt the stabilizing hand of Pharaoh, who told him he was not done fighting yet. With a quick heal, restored him to half health. Infuriated, Tortuga walked up and struck the bear with his fist, critting it. The bear was dazed for a moment as he proceeded into a flurry of blows. Not only did Tortuga crit once, but in his 3 attacks, he critted the bear twice, killing it in a single round of attacks. The party then, excited by this change in the combat, rushed the second bear being held back by Rasmussen. And they dove into the combat, being kept alive by clutch heals from both Pharaoh and Milo. The party was able to recover from the first bear's injuries and were able to hold off the second bear's onslaught, opening up for Tortuga to move in a second time and use all of his energy to perform a second flurry of blows, killing the second bear. With 2 cave bears in tow, and knowing they could earn a great profit from the mare, the party went back into town. On their way to the mayor's house, however, they were stopped by a butcher offering to buy the corpses from them for a fair price. The party then said they were offered much more money by the mayor. This butcher would then be angered by this news, asking how the mayor could waste money buying food at such an exorbitant amount of gold. He then stormed out and began going to the mayor's house himself, seemingly about to give the man a piece of his own mind. The party followed behind, though at a bit of a distance, as this butcher seemed very angry. He would then storm into the house, and from outside, the party would hear a shouting match, though not clearly enough to make out what was happening. It was clear the butcher was very angry at the mayor and seemed comfortable enough to give him a piece of his mind. On his way out, the party would then ask what had happened, and the butcher would explain that the mayor is an idiot offering that much gold, and anyone who sells to him would certainly earn the ire of many of the citizens of the town. So, the party split here. Half of them taking the bears down to have the butcher carve up and pay them a reasonable amount of gold. They weren't eager to make enemies of the town on their first day here. However, Tortuga had unfinished business with the mayor, who had sent him after the boar that had nearly killed him. So Tortuga, backed by his two healers, entered into the mayor's estate and approached him in his office space. Tortuga would then tell the mayor that he was a right vicious cunt. Flip him off, tell him to go fuck himself, and leave the mayor in stunned silence. As Pharaoh followed suit, and Milo provided an apology, saying they didn't mean to be so rude, and that he was sorry about being told to fuck off, before swiftly following his party members. The party would then reconvene, now with the gold made from their bear hunt. They would head off to a nearby tavern to spend their gold on food, on rooms, and on rest. Now, only loosely held together, they figured they seemed to work well enough, and thought they would plot what to do next. Thus ends my telling of the first session of D&D. However, if people are so interested, first of all, you are free to ask any questions or ask for any clarifications about the events that unfolded. But first, I want to extend an offer to those two who are now listening. Hiya, Ubu! We're going over D&D lore right now, and I would like to invite, if you two would like to, no pressure, Juniper and, what was it again? Yes, Lotus. If you would like to join me and talk about your first session from your own words, you are free to. If not, I have much else I can discuss, but if anyone out there has questions for the party, or if my party members would like to talk themselves, this seems like a good time to open things up a bit. And how are you doing, Ubu? But yes, that's basically how the first session went. I arranged the party together, gave them some different reasons to be in Scarin, gave one of the groups an reason to keep secret, and then provided them with a bit of money and the opportunity to take sides with either the mayor or the butcher. In the end, they chose a safer route, I believe. Though the next session would show them taking a very dangerous path. One I'm very excited to tell about sometime in the future. You're feeling very relaxed? That's nice. That's nice to hear. So, can you go back over the classes one more time for me? I know you've got a monk and a ranger. My brain shut up. So we also have a fighter, and that would be Rasmussen. We have a cleric in Pharaoh, and we had a bard. So ultimately, the party had 2 healers, and so 2 healers and basically 3 frontline units. It was a very interesting combination, as they didn't have many damage-based casters, and because their ranger didn't actually build for dex, their overall ranged options were pretty much precedented entirely on the bard's sling and the cleric casting ranged spells. Oh, yeah, it definitely had some decent balance to it. There were definitely some challenges with it as well, though they found ways to make it work very well for them, especially pumping healing into the high damage monk while having a tanky ranger and fighter flanking him. It was either very tough to kill or very easy to accidentally destabilize, because if the front line got spread out, or if their major damage dealer got dropped, things tended to start twisting against them very quickly. So, with that first session out of the way, I believe we have enough time, about 15 minutes, to do one more thing. I don't believe we have enough time to actually do the second session story, though I will be now plotting to do more of these streams in the future. But I would like to do one more breakdown of anything for people, or more so just open it up now to just a raw Q&A. If anybody has any questions at all, what was the hardest fight for the party? What is one of the classes you made and how'd you go about doing it? What was one of your favorite parts of building a world, or why are you so interested in the Fae and Fel? Any specific questions now for these last 15 to 20 minutes? I want to just open it up for you guys to ask, to tell me stories, or just kind of wholly based around what you guys have to say. So, any takers? Any stories? Any questions? And maybe for my own, just like, feelings, what do you guys think of this style of stream? How is it listening to me talk for 2 hours about D&D? What do you think of my lore? And what are you most curious about for me to make a second stream on? If you have a YouTube, I recommend uploading this to it. It would make for a great info dump of everything D&D you're doing. Yeah, I mean, I already have Twitch to automatically save my VODs. I know they only last for a few days, but I probably will be downloading this. I do have a YouTube channel I use for watching. I'm not personally super interested in, like, creating a YouTube channel, though I'll be downloading this VOD, so I'll look into a way I feel comfortable making it permanently available for people to watch. I might have to talk to Juniper about that. I'd definitely love to know more. I'd definitely love to know how much you're going to use vampires in your game. With the Empire you've got set up, I feel like there's a lot of fun options for you there. Is that something you're using in the campaign currently? Is that something more of a background piece, a looming threat? So, to start with that, so basically, I have several arcs and plot lines I've created, and the vampires occupy a lot of them. However, I wanted to also give my party a lot of freedom, because I wanted to make a sandbox campaign. This is a world that I want them to move around to different places, feel them out, and pick a place they like or they hate, and just occupy that one. Change it irrevocably. The vampires are an important part to several of these characters' backstories, and will inevitably come up and be very influential. but I'm never going to push them onto my party. If my party chooses to never go to Askrostia, to never try to find out more about the vampires, then they will probably only have glancing encounters with them. Ultimately, the Ascrostian Empire is entirely occupied with its constant war right on its border and trying to destabilize the world so they do not get wiped out. Because of this, there will be glancing points where a nation is being destabilized by them, and the party will have to choose what to do about it. But unless they actually go to directly conflict with the vampires, I'm never going to force them into an encounter with it. Unless, of course, they change things to the point that the vampires are able to, again, begin their expansion westward. Ultimately, this is a sandbox. Anything here can become a massive looming threat. The vampires just start with a lot of advantageous resources to become one of the more looming set pieces. Just use my YouTube to archive it, maybe, kind of like Junie just did. Yeah, I mean, that probably makes sense. I might end up doing that. It's very high likelihood. No matter what, I'll be downloading this, and I'll look into where I feel most comfortable with making it up and available. You know what? How about this? You guys have full control now. If you have specific questions you have, keep asking. If you got stories you want to tell, keep telling. But if you guys want, I'm willing to take any one of these pieces, one of the classes, the subclass, or one of my races, and just sort of give you guys an intro to them, why I started building them, and just a quick look at how I kind of homebrew a thing. If, however, you have more questions you specifically, I'm more than down for that. Because we've got about 15 minutes before I'm going to be calling the stream here. So get it in if you want to. Oh, but most importantly, and this is one I'd really like everybody available to give me a comment on. What would you like my next D&D stream to focus on? Obviously, people love hearing these session stories, and I'll be down to tell a few of them, but... Oh yeah. Honestly, I feel like in the very early sessions, I probably should have been more railroady than I was. It's a hilarious thing to drop people directly into a sandbox and think, yep, I'm doing the best thing by not railroading at all. However, you then put the entire onus on your players. And definitely for my first few sessions, because I didn't give them really any direction to go in, things stagnated a bit and sort of gotten to the point of just sort of not knowing what to do. I'll never say to railroad your characters, but especially if you're trying to build a vast sandbox to play in, make sure you have some really well set arcs for them to go through that they can break from at any point, but that give them something that's constantly pulling them in a direction, but that they feel comfortable going away from. Ooh, you enjoy info about monsters, items, environments, and ecosystems. Alright, the next session I think I could talk a bit more about my Badlands region. I think that could probably give you a bit, or I could just go into some of the monsters I've invented, and I do have a massive list of homebrew items. Yes, I think going over those might make a good stream number 2. I like tent poling. There are certain things that are going to happen. How the players get there are up to them. If I need to, I'll sink a story hook into them if they start to flounder. Yeah, I think it's a very practical way to go about it. Ultimately, I think we all try to build the type of campaign we personally want to play, which can be both great and unfortunate for people DMing. And for me, I always wanted to just get dropped into a world and start fucking shit up. But for some people, I know being able to have a foreseeable goal and pushing towards it with obvious progression just feels so much better than wandering around, just kind of interacting with small pieces, trying to invent a goal from nothing. You know what? To give you guys just a few quick things, I'll go ahead and show you just a couple of my homebrewed items. So let's see your type. We'll go for magic items. Let's filter this up a bit. So here we go. I have made quite a lot of homebrew items right now. A lot of them are very simple. A lot of them represent stuffs from older editions. And some of them are just very rare or interesting. So, let's get into which one. Yes, I think we can go ahead and start with me talking about the sender's envelope. Now, this I wanted to be a cheaper and I thought little more flavorful version of a sending stone. Something that is more common for people to have, something that has a bit of character to it, but something that fulfills a very similar purpose. So this is a sender's envelope. These are enchanted, thin boxes made of a rare soft wood, each clearly marked as either a sender or receiver, and easily matched to the other boxes currently linked to them. When a receiver box is created, you roll 1d4, and the box is able to maintain this many sender links to it at one time. When a sender's box is created, it must be inscribed with sigils that link it to the receivers. With an available link, those sigil sequence you know, and that is on the same plane of existence as you. To use this item, you must write a letter or drawing on a material able to fit within the box, preferably paper or vellum. And this item also has to be in no way prevented from teleportation. Objects affected can be countered by a counter spell. Then the letter is inserted into one of these sender boxes. Once inserted, the box is broken and will immediately be consumed. The contents of this box is then sent to the linked receiver box. The sender box being consumed in a small, slow-burning flame. The receiver box will then have a copy of that letter printed inside it and begin glowing hot to inform the receiver. If the receiver box is broken, all senders linked to it become non-magical. Essentially, these are small wooden envelopes that you're able to put a note into, break, and have it sent to a very specific receiving box. I really kind of like these because they allow players to now send letters instead of speaking to other people, either needing a very expensive sending spell or a very expensive sending stone. These were meant to be a way to send drawings, letters, or just quick notes to people so that they could be filled with almost a more interesting sense of character, in my opinion, and to be cheaper and easier to gather. Let's do one more, shall we? This is a great one, actually. And the last thing we will be discussing today, then, is the Whisperer's Lantern. This was a unique magic item I created to help some mysterious people in my campaign get away with remaining undetected. However, just recently the party has gotten their hands on their own, and will likely making good use of this. A Whisperer's Lantern is a large oil-fed lantern with two adjacent knobs. The lantern casts a bright light in a 30-foot radius and dim light for an additional 30 feet, Once it burns for 6 hours, once lit, it burns for 6 hours on a flask of oil. As an action, you can lower the oil knob, reducing the light to a dim light in a 5-foot radius and consuming only half the amount of oil. While this lantern is lit, you may use an action to adjust the second knob. When flipped, the lantern's light will change to a soft blue glow, casting a dim light in a 30-foot or 5-foot radius. Additionally, while in this state, the lantern creates a spherical zone 15 foot in radius, from which no sound below a casual conversation can be heard. Sounds louder than this can be heard outside the area of the sphere with a 15 perception check, made with advantage. Though even then, no specific words can be understood. As you can tell, this is a very nice item to keep in a tent when having covert conversations, or something useful to keep on your person when you're not worried about someone seeing your glow, but hearing your footsteps. I have many other magical items and creatures to show you in the future. I have many more stories to tell of my campaign, and most excitedly, I have 72 countries worth of lore to share with you. But all of that will have to wait until my next stream, as we have now been going for a few hours. I do hope all of you have had fun in this stream. I hope all of you will come into the future to see more. And please, anyone at any point, feel free to message or whisper me any specific questions, or if you would like any of the links to my resources that I've created or that I use. I love the idea of people looking at my homebrew stuff and telling me how it's unbalanced or how it's interesting or what they would change about it. The question I have is, did your party get theirs from a guy who suddenly wasn't using it anymore? No, actually, they purchased it off of a fellow who sold not exactly legal objects. After all, whisperer lanterns tend to have a bit of a reputation for being used by unsavory sorts. However, with that answer, I must say goodnight to you all. I hope to see you all in the future. Do not hesitate to whisper or ask me any more questions going forward, or anything else. Good night, everybody. And I'll be sure to announce when I do my next D&D stream. Until then.